Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I am Adriana Esquivel-Milbert, and I'm very pleased to introduce the second webinar of our webinar series. Today with Flavia Costa from the Institute of Amazonian Research, Brazilian Institute of Amazonian Research. This webinar series is organized by the International Tree Mortality Network in partnership with the IUFRO, and today hosted by the Birmingham Institute of Forest Research. For those who are not familiar with the International Tree Mortality Network, our aim is to bring together researchers and practitioners from different disciplines and across the world to generate a global understanding of the trends in tree mortality. This is who we are, and part of us are also members of the IUFRO Task Force on tree mortality, and we are very grateful to have an amazing advisory board that guide us, help us to go through our missions. If you want to know more about the activities of the International Tree Mortality Network, please join our group through the website. The link is in the chat, and also you can send us email. The email will be in the chat as well. One of our main activities is to promote science on tree mortality. We do that via our Twitter account. So we have launched the tree mortality paper hashtag. So if you want to highlight your research or research of other people interested in research on tree mortality, please use the hashtag tree mortality paper. We also have this seminar series to highlight researchers that have been doing interesting work on tree mortality. And these happen every 6 to 8 weeks. And if you have any suggestions for future speakers, please contact us using the email or a direct message via the Twitter account. For today's webinar, we will have a presentation of around 45 minutes. Then we have 30 minutes for question and answer. So you can use the question and answer function to ask questions. All questions will be managed through that function. So please don't use the chat for that. Use the question and answer function. And Bernard will be managing that and will be then leading the question and answer session. We apologize if your question is not selected. This will depend on the number of questions, and you are likely to merge similar questions. Please use the chat function if you have any technical difficulties. Nadine will be managing that for us today. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Flavia Costa from the Brazilian Institute of Amazonian Research. She holds a bachelor's in biology from the University of São Paulo, and a master's in environmental science from the same university, and a PhD in ecology from the Brazilian Institute of Amazonian Research. Flavia has been living in Manaus, in the heart of the Brazilian Amazon, since 1996, if I'm right, when she started her PhD investigating the effects of selective logging on understory plants. And since then, she has studied plant ecology in a great detail and impressive breadth. Her research group, the research from her research group ranges from using near-infrared spectrometry to identify tree species, to detecting biogeographical patterns across the whole Amazon basin, and understanding early domestication of Amazonian species. In addition to her fascinating research, Flavia has been a keen promoter of women in science and has been supervising a series of rising stars in ecology in Brazil. Today, she's speaking about one of the main focus of her group, how hydrology, in particular water table depth, influences the responses of trees to climate change. the floor is with you, Flavia. Thanks for joining us. I'll stop sharing so you can share your screen.
Thank you, Adriane. So let me see here. Now, where's the presentation? Just a second. Okay, hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much, Adriane and all the network for this invitation. I'm happy to talk about this research we have been conducting maybe for 20 years now, although I'm going to show more recent results. And of course, as most research, this is not my work alone, and it's a very large group working together. Most of them are named here, and I hope I didn't forget any important person. And as the title says, I'm going to talk about tree mortality along local hydrological gradients, and discuss with you how this link of the water table depth of trees to the water table depth may save or condemn trees as the climate changes. So we are used to see in the last decades, unfortunately, these news and studies of the droughts increasing. And we have seen this series of ever increasing intensity and extent of droughts in the Amazon since 2005. Actually, we had a very strong drought in 2097, 98. And this has been increasing in frequency and intensity and raises very large concerns about the future of the Amazon. And there's also several studies showing what is going on in terms of the forest response. And these responses have been some sort of alarming, with increasing mortality and increasing and a change in biomass, many times a loss of biomass. And I know you all know that, and this is lots of the reason of studying tree mortality is because of climate change. So I understand that people are concerned about this potential dark future of the Amazon, and we have lots of reason for that. But today I want to talk about the potential other side of droughts, a side that is not so dark and maybe somehow bright. And to understand this other potential other side, we need to understand the effects of not only climate on plants, but also what happens to water after water enters the system through precipitation. And lots of studies have focused in precipitation as the water source, which of course makes a lot of sense. But water is not only determined, water availability is not only determined by precipitation. It is determined also as it reaches the soil by topography. And it's logical that water is drained vertically and goes to the groundwater. But also there is this convergence of the groundwater towards the lower parts of the topographic profiles, such that plants distributed across those profiles do not have the same amount of water available. For instance, those plants in the upper parts of the topography with roots cannot access the groundwater, they are limited to the water that comes through precipitation. But those plants in the lower parts of the topography, they may be in direct contact with the water table, and they may be even seasonally waterlogged or permanently waterlogged. And this is not because of flooding. So we are not talking here of forests getting flooded by large rivers, but a phenomenon that affects all areas of groundwater convergence, be these small valleys or creeks or whatever. And actually, these groundwater conversions to lower areas is what allows the existence of forests even in the arid zones. We see here these images of large vegetation in the middle of a very arid region. And these are exactly where we see there is a lower portion in the topography. So, of course, water in these regions is good for plant development. But we also need to consider what happens in regions that are naturally wet. They have lots of precipitation, or they have a seasonal, a small dry season during the year. And in these cases, of course, the shallow water table regions have more water during the dry season, which is good for the plants, but also it might have water excess during the wet season, which means depletion of the oxygen, and this is detrimental to plant development and may even put plants in the state of hibernation or very low growth. The other difficult situation for plants in these regions is shallow roots, because the oxygen depletion leads the trees to not be able to grow below the water line. And these shallow roots, coupled to these waterlogged soils, may increase the instability of root anchoring, which is also a problem for the maintenance of trees standing. So it might become clear that these special features of forests with shallow water table are expected to lead to very different responses of trees to climate variation than those that we normally see in deep water table forests. And yet, at the same time, there is some bias of studies about the climate change effects towards forests with deep water tables. Here we see in light blue the frequency distribution of water table depths, and in yellow the frequency distribution of the plot network that it has been mostly used for evaluations of climate change in the Amazon. And we see there is a mismatch, and here in red is the distribution of plots that my group is studying, and we have been doing this effort to increase the representation of shallow water tables. And this is really relevant, not only because the responses might be different, but also because this area covered by shallow water tables, here we are using this limit of 5 meters deep. This area is very large, and you see it dominates here in the west part of the Amazon, but also in these regions of the Brazilian and Guiana Shield. All these small dots represent the valleys that have these conditions. So there is this very large region that is understudied, and this means a large knowledge gap on these effects of the precipitation and soil drainage on the forest function. Well, this scenario led us to pose some hypotheses on the forest function related to the water table depth. And we need to remember that the level, the water table depth, changes from months, from seasons within the same year, but also across years. I'm calling here a normal year, one that is the average of the historical conditions of a site, and the moderate droughts, the droughts we have seen so far. I know some people would call not of them moderate, but I call extreme droughts those that might put the water table depth beyond the reach of plants in the lower portions of topography. And later I will explain why this is relevant. So let's examine what we expect in a normal year, where the water table is very shallow in these lower parts of topography and deep in the upper parts. Plants here do not have access to the water table. And in this shallow region, we have this condition of anoxia during the wet season, or depending on the conditions of the place, it might take most of the year. And this anoxia will limit growth, and these plants having shallow roots and soil instability will have a higher risk of uprooting and fall during storms. And this should lead then to lower growth and higher mortality. But what would we expect in a moderate drought? Well, then we expect that water table levels will drop and relieve the anoxia or hypoxia of the soils, but it's still the soil is wet and the trees have access to moisture. They may even be in contact with the capillary fringe. And then these plants would actually show higher growth and lower mortality than those in the upper parts of the topography, where the plants will become stressed by lack of water and show all the typical responses to drought that have been reported. So you have seen there is this switch between of expectations between normal years being bad for plants in shallow water tables to moderate droughts being actually good for those plants. And I'll show you results from our research based mostly in two sites that have been intensively studied with permanent plots. One is very close to Manaus, it's the Reserva Dulce, long-term ecological site. And the other is this series of sites actually along the BR319. Sites are more or less 1,500 kilometers from each other and have these series of plots. And one important point about those plots, they are laid following the altitudinal contour. This means each plot has the same topographic conditions. So they may make it fall here in a plateau or in a stream, and they don't mix conditions within the same plot. So they are good to evaluate those hydrological questions. And we also put together our data and the data from the rainfall network for all the Amazon basin to evaluate these questions. So here the effects of the shallow water tables in normal years. And we have been seeing, this is based on 20 years of data from Reserva Duque, that indeed the mortality rates are larger in the shallow water tables compared to the deep. And this is actually increased. This effect is higher in the very wet years. So we have a higher mortality in shallow water tables in normal years compared to deep. And we have an increase in this mortality in very wet years. And we can expect this is linked to very wet years having a higher proportion of storms that kill trees. And then we examine that, and indeed we see that mortality rates increase with the frequency of storms in the shallow water table forests, but not in the deep water table forests. And then we wanted to see what is the effect of these trends in mortality when we look at the biomass productivity and biomass stock, since we can expect that lower growth and higher mortality should decrease both of them. And indeed, this is the case. We have around 19% lower biomass in shallow water table forests compared to deep water tables. And we have around 24% lower biomass stock in shallow water tables. And looking here at this spatial distribution of biomass values, we can see that even within the same climatic zone, and here I'm showing the region we have been studying, the plots in Reserva Duque and a few other sites around Manaus, and the BR319 plots. Both of these sites have around 2 to 3 months of dry season, so the same climatic regime, and they are all unfertile soils. So here, most of this change, very strict change in biomass, is due to these different hydrological conditions. So moving now to the effects of shallow water tables in drought years. I show you here the results of these series of plots, series of sites and several plots within them along the BR319. And you can see here the average depth of water table across those plots. They are all very shallow, from less than 1 to 7 meters depth. And in this region dominated by shallow water tables, we didn't see an increase in mortality in the 2015 drought. As you can see here, the values of mortality before the drought and during the drought are mostly the same on average. And this is the same for palms and trees. We thought it was important to separate those effects because trees and palms have different hydrological or hydraulic properties. And interesting, we observed this increase in recruitment rates during the drought, which might indicate, as we expected, that these plants are having better conditions for growth as anoxia is relieved, and then there is this increase in recruitment. Looking here in more detail to this data, this is the mortality rate against the water table depth measured at the plot level. And in the period before the 2015 drought, we have this clear relationship of higher mortality where the water table is shallow, as I showed before. But in the year of the drought, we simply don't have this relationship. So the mortality is relieved in these plots, and then we don't see that effect. And here back to Reserva Duque, and then evaluating these, the effects of shallow versus deep water tables on mortality and growth. And we see that as drought becomes more intense, deep water table forests indeed have increased mortality, but not in the shallow water tables. They seem to be mostly buffered from these droughts. And again, in terms of growth, the same. The deep water table forests show the decreased growth, and the shallow water table forests seem mostly buffered. And here we can see these growth patterns examined in more detail with dendrometric bands along months. And it's very striking that in the months that we had the strongest water deficits, those red bars in the upper graph, we have this very strong decrease in growth in the valleys and in the plateaus and slopes, which are the deep water table regions. But we don't see much of a change in the valleys with shallow water tables. And this is very contrasting to the patterns we see in the historical average of 2001 to 2015, where you can see that plateaus and slopes tend to have higher growth than the valleys. And here, finally, one study at the remote sensing level. And this is of the 2005 drought using the MODIS satellite. The area that actually suffered the drought is highlighted in the map, and the dark zones didn't went through the drought. So analyzing the greenness anomaly, which means which cells got greener, which might indicate new leaves, more chlorophyll, and which cells got brown, which means leaf loss, and this might be coupled to the growth at the stem level. We see that this EVI anomaly is positive in the shallow water table region and tends to become brown as we go deep. So again, the same effect of buffering and perhaps enhancing effect of drought in shallow water table regions. So I hope so far you got the message that in normal years where it's wet, shallow water table conditions kind of limit forest growth and increase mortality, but actually in moderate droughts, these regions are benefited, they are at least buffered, but might have also increased growth. And so the question is, what if droughts become even more extreme than what we have seen so far? And to understand that, we need to go through some of the traits that plants in these conditions have. So I already said that rooting depth is associated to the water table depth. And this beautiful work by Ying-Fan shows this almost one-to-one relationship of rooting depth to water table depth. And this means shallow water tables tend to have very shallow roots. And also, we have been working in understanding the hydraulic traits of plants in these contrasting situations of shallow and deep water tables. And we saw that the xylem vulnerability tends to be much higher in plants associated to shallow water tables than in plants associated to deep water tables. And this is also reflected in a number of anatomical traits, which are more indirect. But here I show the mean vessel area, which tends to be higher in the shallow water tables than in deep. And this was a study at Reserva Duque. So we asked how general is that? So we increased the sample covering other places in covering wet regions and more dry regions in the south of the Amazon, and also fertile soils and infertile soils. And we see that the pattern is mostly the same. Shallow water tables, those in blue, are always more vulnerable. So plants here tend to be much more, have xylems that are much more vulnerable to hydraulic failure, and then plants in the deep water tables, despite the changes in climate or soil fertility, which do affect this trait, but much less than water table depth. So these plants in shallow water table are more vulnerable. And then we should expect that shallow water table forests should show actually increased mortality with droughts. But we analyzed these mortality rates separating deep and shallow water tables. Each dot here is a species. And we saw that plants that are more vulnerable, that have more vulnerable xylems, indeed have increased mortality in droughts if they are in deep water table places, but not in shallow water table places. So this indicated that this hydraulic vulnerability of plants is not a problem so far, while droughts are not drying enough the soil. So there is enough moisture to keep going and have all those other positive effects that I showed you. But we should ask, again, what will happen if the water table level falls below the level plants can reach? So as I said, the roots are shallow, and if the water table level goes beyond their reach, these plants may become severely limited in their access to water during extreme drought. And they have all these hydraulic traits that are not resistant. And this could place those plants in severe risk of hydraulic failure and could lead to a strong collapse of these valley and other shallow water table regions. And so this would put us again in the dark side of the future of the Amazon. And so here I tried to put together all these ideas on how are those deep and shallow water table forests contribute to the balance of the carbon balance of the Amazon, depending on drought severity. So we saw that the deep and shallow water table forests have different responses, but these responses depend on drought severity. And in red, we see that deep water table forests tend to have carbon loss as the droughts increase because of the drier soil conditions, while in these not too severe droughts, the shallow water table forests are still capturing carbon and not suffering from drought, but these might turn into these dotted lines here if roots, the effect of shallow roots is indeed important, and then we might have this very large increase in carbon loss due to this strong effect of drought severity on shallow roots. So I hope I conveyed you, sorry, with this message that the shallow water tables have this potential to buffer the effects of moderate droughts and may even counterbalance the loss in deep water tables if the forests have good conditions and increased growth. But they also have this potential of being very vulnerable to strong droughts and collapse under extreme droughts. So there is this balance that needs to be understood. And this is what we are doing now. We have this new project called The Other Side of Tropical Droughts. And this team of mostly young people, very keen to do measurements in the forest. We are about to install some new towers on those shallow water table settings and monitor several aspects of forest function to better understand how much can we generalize what I have been showing here to other regions and what is the contribution to the full carbon balance of the Amazon. So I will close here with this positive message because, well, we have been bombarded by bad news the last year and this year. So let's look at the bright side of the drought. This is it. Thank you. Get in contact with if you have questions that you are not answered today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Flavia. Amazing, amazing talk. Very interesting. I think now I will invite Bernhard to lead our question and answer. So everyone, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A. We have a few questions there already.
Yeah, also from my side, thanks a lot for this great talk. We have several questions so far to the what defines site with shallow water table of the stand characteristics. So for example, are how are these sites recharged? Are they fed by rainfall events, or are they close by to rivers and recharged by rivers?
Well, good question. The hydrology of these of the water table is something that I would urge people in the hydrological area to come and study more. So the settings that have been well studied so far are those in the Guiana Shield and especially in the Brazilian Shield. So those north of Manaus or very southwest of Manaus. And these have this typical conformation that I showed you, this plateau to valley topography. So they have the classical hill slope hydrology. So they are recharged through precipitation. Precipitation percolates, infiltrates, very little superficial drainage. So most of the water goes through the soil and recharges the water table. So precipitation and recharge are very linked, and very little charge back from the valleys. But there are some studies in the large rivers showing there is this two-side effect. So the not only the water comes from the upper parts to the lower parts, but also might get from the river towards the earth, the soil, when it's very wet. And this is very complex, and I'm not an hydrologist to explain. But also there is this huge area to the west of the Amazon where the topography is very flat, not flat, but much flatter than the east side. And there we don't know what is going on. It's a large field that needs to be explored to be able to feed models of the water table behavior that would feed models of the plant behavior.
You compared a lot sites with shallow water table and deep water table. Are these sites comparable in soil type and soil texture? The one question, for example, is that what is more important, rooting depth or the capillary fringe, the capillary lift of water?
Well, I would not be able to answer this last one because we are not studying at this level of detail. And again, it would be much better to have hydrologists doing these detailed studies together with us. In terms of the soil properties, yes, there is variation in soil properties, mostly in terms of texture. So we cannot pair in none of the regions that we are studying sites that have exactly the same texture, because texture is affected by drainage. So it changes along the profile because of drainage. But we have controlled at least the soil fertility. So the soil fertility is mostly the same within regions that have been derived from the Guiana Shield, which are mostly not fertile or derived from sediments in the more recent region along the BR319, which are a little more fertile. So these we can control, and I hope it's not the cause of the differences we have shown.
Mm-hmm. We have some questions with acclimation potential, but I'm not sure it's mainly related on root related. So the question is kind of that species occurring at sites with shallow water table, it's assumed that they have short, they do not root very deep, and if they develop a deeper root system during drought conditions.
We don't know. We don't know.
It might be too early to answer, because we have some questions regarding the species composition, and if it's expected that species composition might change due to climate change, especially that maybe species that are more present or more occur rather on sites with deep reaching water table, that they now move into sites with a shallow water table.
Well, yeah, this is what we expect. I kind of see shallow water tables being the same as mountain tops for climate change linked to drought. So mountain tops are the refuges for plants that are getting warmer in the base of mountains. So they are climbing the mountain, and here they will actually go down the mountain to the valleys where there's more water. This is what we might expect, and we could expect then a very large change in species composition of, especially if plants in the valleys are not able to cope with the droughts. If they become really extreme, that they might be completely substituted by those coming from the upper parts. And then these might have the roots that are able to grow deep, perhaps, but we actually don't know much of root plasticity so far. It's a very large area to do research again.
At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that 36% of Amazon has shallow water table. What data are that based on?
Oh, this is the Yingfan and Miguel Macho publication. This is a model they developed to calculate the water table depth. So they did this amazing collection of data points where water table depth was actually measured, including in cities, but also research sites. And they developed this model. And don't ask me about the details of the model because, again, I'm not an hydrologist, but this is the basis for this number.
But since you started now to mention the models, I have one question from Harald Buchmann, who says that to his knowledge, the dynamic global vegetation models do not include water table depth as a trait or as a proxy. If they did, how different do you think their results might be? Also, the dynamic global vegetation models currently species distribution that does not include this very important soil property, most likely. So do you think that the outcome of the future species distribution might show a complete different picture if one might consider the water table depth?
Definitely. I think this is an important gap in most of the models. And I really do not understand. Well, I kind of understand it's difficult. Conceptually, I don't understand why it's not included. In practice, I do understand because, well, it's not a simple thing to do. But of course, the functional types, the distribution of functional types will change completely when you include that, because the hydraulic properties of plants are directly controlled by water table depth. So as you include that, you change the effects of precipitation, because precipitation drains and distributes differently across the profile. Within the same climate, you have plants with different access to water, and they have different hydraulic properties. So obviously, inclusion of these models changes everything and needs to be done, of course.
Since you mentioned the hydraulic properties, there are some physiological questions. How different are the species that occur on sites with shallow water table compared to those at deep water table? Also, silent structure, we assume, is affected. Resistance against embolism.
Yeah, I didn't show details on the species composition and structure, but our previous work, we detailed that, and the forests in the shallow water tables tend to be shorter. Well, I'm talking about the middle of the Amazon. If we go to the borders, it's reversed because the climate becomes dry. of course. But in the core of the Amazon, shallow water table forests tend to be shorter, less dense forests, and the species composition is different. It's not that we do not have shared species. We do. There is a set of species restricted to shallow water tables, a set of species restricted to deep, but also species that are crossing the boundaries. And these are also an important area of a gap of research of the plasticity. We are starting now, I have a student studying the plasticity of plants across this gradient, because of course this is very relevant to understand, are they going to adapt or not? So yes, there is a series of differences in composition, structure, and traits. The hydraulic trait I showed was embolism resistance, and the roots we know through this other compilation, but actually nobody has studied roots along this gradient so far to, well, say what else about roots.
Where do you observe a higher species diversity? And
well, actually is in the drier areas. It's in the upper plateaus.
You now described the results or showed the results for the Amazon. Do you expect similar patterns in different biomes, as in temperate ecosystems and boreal ecosystems?
Why not? If the plants need water and water is not controlled only by precipitation, why in other ecosystems it would be different? I don't talk about places with ice because this might complicate things, but everywhere else. Actually, there is a very nice review by Ying Fan again, and she's an important reference to all this work, showing her predictions for the effects of water table in terms of vegetation structure across biomes. So I would recommend reading of that.
We have one physiological question also that kind of, maybe I think you showed yourself, but the question is, if you consider carbon starvation as a why did the trees die, hydraulic failure, carbon starvation, you showed for the, in response to, I think the 2015 drought event, that and the sites with deep water table, that there was a good relationship between P50, embolism resistance, and mortality. And the more resistant species, kind of, for some it might be surprising, showed higher mortality rates.
Sorry, I'm not sure I got
that the species with a more embolism resistant xylem showed higher mortality rates.
Oh no, it was the opposite.
Oh, it was opposite.
The opposite. No, it's it's what we said. This would be very
right. Because, but do we consider carbon starvation or hydraulic failure as a dominant control strategy with your data? As that.
Sorry.
Sorry. Either the anaerobic, the more embolism resistant species might simply die from hydraulic failure, but the more isohydric species might die from carbon starvation.
Yeah, we didn't analyze the stomatic control yet. This is important thing to do yet. So I can answer that.
In your region, is it possible to apply tree ring related research? Do the trees produce tree rings?
I think it should, because tree rings go much deeper in time than we can with other methods, right?
And you have a pronounced dry season, so there should be. Well,
some regions, yes. In the sites we have been working more, I would not say it's strong dry season. It's 2 to 3 months. Some species do form rings is all this work of Johann Schongard in our institute, and he showed that several species do form rings, even if they are in a tropical wet forest, but not all. And this is, so selecting correct species, those that are well described to form rings, yes, it's possible to use the chronology.
Craig Allen is asking kind of if climate change causes an increase in magnitude and variability in the ratio of both wet and dry years, and especially in the wet and dry extremes.
Oh, okay.
Rainfall events and large drought events or intensive drought events. How might you incorporate this amplified variability in your models of forest growth and productivity?
Well, I cannot make a prediction because the models would need to specify the amount of those different scenarios to because one kind of counterbalance the other, right? If we increase the wet years, we get increased mortality in the shallow water tables. If we increase dry years, we get the opposite. So this balance between them may get into zero, may get it positive, may get negative, depending on how much they go. We have a paper examining these effects of very wet years that actually came out today in the New Phytologist, so you can check there. Some of the research I showed you today is there about the water table depth effects, but also we look at the effect of extremely wet years. So go there, check.
Did you also compare understory and upper canopy species? So whether difference in tree size affects different mortality rates?
Well, this is a good question, and we haven't yet dig into that. You could expect always the small plants to be more protected from droughts, no matter what. But at the same time, if these places indeed get dry, like the water table that go down, small trees should suffer first because of the shallow roots, right? So we didn't do this exploration so far, but it's interesting, it is important. And I would expect that there would be the big problem for like recovering, if these areas get a collapse in the vegetation, recovery would not be possible unless plants come from other places, because the native species won't be able to establish, because small plants would be especially vulnerable.
I'm trying to check if I missed some important questions. So if we... I think you answered that. Were there differences in biomass distribution across shallow and deep water table sites? Was there a difference in biomass distribution across shallow and deep water table sites?
Yes, it's much higher in the deep water table places than in shallow. Well, not much higher, but it's around 25% higher in deep.
How long can the trees occurring at the shallow water table sites tolerate anoxic conditions or anaerobic conditions?
Very good question. We don't know. And because there is a large science of flooding. So many people have studied plants in flooded forests, those that actually get water over the trees. But I don't know of research in places that only get water in the root zone but don't get flooded. We could perhaps consider that it's not so bad as flooded areas, and then those plants are not suffering so much, but these are different species, so we don't know. I can't answer that now.
I think we have more or less answered most questions, or at least addressed most topics. A lot of the questions were root related. So it seems like there's room for more root related stuff. For example, also if some of the species have root parenchyma to support the roots to tolerate anaerobic conditions, rooting depths seems also quite important.
Yeah, this is studies that we are starting, and we would have started last year if the pandemics did came. But I have a student who's going to be doing exactly that, examining the root traits across this hydrologic gradient. There's other students looking at the plasticity of species across this gradient, another one starting with the photosynthesis and adjustment of photosynthesis along this gradient. And so, well, yes, there is lots of things to be done, and there is space for a lot more of research that is needed to understand more of the biology of those plants and their response to this water fluctuation.
I would say thank you very, very much for all the questions. I think those of you that where we might not have answered the questions, you of course feel free to contact Flavia directly yourself. Adriani, do you want to take the last words?
Yeah, I just want to thank again for Flavia for this amazing, very impressive talk. And also add that this is in the middle of the Amazon, so it's extra challenging research. And
you know that by yourself.
Yes, and thanks all the participants. And we will be promoting other talks. So if you have any suggestions, email us. And if you want to contact us via Twitter or email, feel free to do so. And thanks again, Flavia. I think there are lots of thanks, everyone. Really, really enjoyed the talk. It was great.
Thank you all too.